I called my son while I was at the grocery store. Do you want pumpkin pie or apple pie for Thanksgiving? Son, I asked. He stayed silent for a moment, then said, Oh, we already had Thanksgiving dinner yesterday. I thought he was joking. Then his wife grabbed the phone and said everything was easier without you there. I gave the cake to a homeless boy and asked him, Do you want to change your life? 3 hours later, my son called back and started screaming. Welcome to Dad's Revenge Stories. I'm so grateful you're here. Where are you watching from today? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Also, please note, this story includes fictional elements crafted for entertainment and valuable lessons. Any resemblance to names or places is purely coincidental, but the core message remains deeply meaningful. The can of cranberry sauce was the last thing on my list. I remember standing in the baking aisle of Ralph's on Colorado Boulevard, holding a small notepad my late wife Margaret had given me the Christmas before she passed. She had written her grocery lists in this same notepad for 11 years. The handwriting on the older pages was hers, loopy, unhurried, full of personality. The handwriting on my page that morning was mine, blocky, careful, the penmanship of a man who spent 40 years gripping electrical wire instead of a pen. Cranberry sauce, dinner rolls, whipped cream for the pie. I had already spent 3 hours that morning wrapping the last of the paperwork I intended to bring to Thanksgiving dinner. Not the cranberry sauce, not the rolls. The envelope sitting on my kitchen table back home on Marengo Avenue that was the real gift. Inside it was a single folded letter, 2 pages explaining in plain language what I had done with my savings over the past 4 years. $480,000. I want to be honest about what that number meant to a man like me. I was not a surgeon. I was not a hedge fund manager or a tech executive or any of the things my son Ethan liked to imply he was adjacent to at dinner parties. I was a licensed electrician who worked 39 years for a mid-sized contractor in Pasadena, showed up before sunrise most mornings, and came home with burned fingertips and a paycheck that was respectable but never extraordinary. The money in that envelope represented every deferred vacation, every skipped appliance upgrade, every bonus quietly folded into a savings account, while I drove a truck with 200,000 miles on it, because the truck still ran fine. I had bought the house on Willowbrook Lane 6 weeks earlier. 1 story, 3 bedrooms, a covered back porch that caught the afternoon light the way Margaret always said a porch should. I had walked through it twice with Ethan and his wife Lauren in September. Lauren had said the kitchen backsplash was dated. Ethan had measured the garage with his phone and announced it was big enough for both cars. Neither of them had asked me a single question about how I had managed to buy it outright. I had not minded. Watching them move through the rooms had felt like enough. I put the cranberry sauce in my cart and checked the time. 11:47, dinner was at 2. I had plenty of time to finish shopping, go home, change my shirt, and drive the 18 minutes to Ethan and Lauren's place on Sycamore Drive. I pulled out my phone to call ahead, the way Margaret had always insisted on doing before showing up anywhere, because she said it was the difference between a guest and an intrusion. I called Ethan at 11:47 with the phone wedged against my shoulder and 2 desserts in my hands. Hey son, I said. Pumpkin pie or apple pie, which one should I bring for Thanksgiving? The silence that followed was long enough for me to look at the phone screen and make sure the call had not dropped. Then he spoke. There was a pause. I heard Lauren's voice somewhere behind him, low and quick, the way she spoke when she did not want to be quoted. Dad. Ethan's voice shifted. Not softer, flatter. We did dinner last night. For a moment, my brain treated the sentence like nonsense. I almost laughed. I thought he was joking that maybe Lauren's family had stopped by early and they had opened a few things and the real dinner was still tomorrow. What do you mean? I asked. Everyone came over. He said it the way you might explain a scheduling change to a cable company. Informational. He said it the way you might explain a scheduling change to a cable company. Information. Unattached. It just worked out better for Lauren's family to come Wednesday, so we moved it. My chest tightened the way it had the one time I grabbed a live wire without checking the breaker first. A single full-body recognition that something had gone wrong before my brain had finished processing what. You moved Thanksgiving, I said. It's not a big deal, Dad. It's just a date. Ethan. I kept my voice even. You didn't call me? Another pause. Lauren's voice again sharper this time, still too low to make out the words. When Ethan spoke again, something had changed in his voice. The flatness had become something harder. Deliberate. There was movement on the other end. Then Lauren's voice replaced his not soft, not accidental, the voice of someone who had decided in advance that she was the one who would say this. Honestly, Walter, everything was just easier without you there. She said it the way you state a fact you have verified and found satisfactory. Ethan did not take the phone back. He did not correct her. The silence that followed told me everything his voice had not. He did not raise his voice. He did not sound cruel the way people sound when they want you to know they are being cruel. He sounded like a man who had thought carefully about something and arrived at a conclusion he found reasonable. That was what made it so hard to hold on to the cart handle. All right, I said. I do not know why I said all right. I had not agreed to anything. I had not forgiven anything. My mouth simply needed to produce a sound that would end the call before my voice cracked in the middle of a grocery store on Thanksgiving morning. I hung up. The dinner rolls were still in my hand. I placed them back on the shelf with more care than was necessary, the way your hands operate on their own when your mind has gone somewhere else entirely. The cart in front of me held cranberry sauce, whipped cream, and a box of Margaret's preferred brand of coffee I had grabbed out of habit, because for 20 years she had drunk 1 cup every Thanksgiving morning, before anyone else woke up, and I still bought it without thinking. I left the cart where it stood and walked out of Ralph's into the flat November light. The parking lot smelled like rain that had not arrived yet. My truck was parked near the cart return because Margaret had always said that parking near the cart return was the mark of a person who understood cause and effect. I sat in the driver's seat with the door open and the keys in my hand. $480,000. The envelope was still on my kitchen table. The house on Willowbrook Lane still had my name on the deed, every page, every line, every notarized signature. No transfer had been recorded. No ownership had changed. I had intended to hand them the future that afternoon over a plate of turkey and cranberry sauce I had picked out myself. I stared at the storefront. Inside that Ralph's, behind the automatic doors and the holiday sale signs, was a chocolate cake I had also planned to bring. I had skipped it on the list because I thought I would grab it last after the rolls as a small extra thing. I went back inside and got it. I did not know yet what I was going to do with it. I only knew I was not going to leave it behind. I drove north on Lake Avenue without deciding to. That is the most honest way I can describe the 20 minutes after I left that parking lot. My hands were on the wheel. My foot worked the brake at the right intersections. I stopped for a red light at California Boulevard and watched a family of 4 cross in front of my truck. The father carrying a toddler on his hip, the mother holding a casserole dish covered in foil, 2 older kids running ahead in their good shoes. They were late somewhere. They were expected somewhere. The light turned green, and I stayed put until the car behind me tapped its horn and I moved forward, because that is what you do when the light turns green. The chocolate cake was on the passenger seat in a white bakery box. I had paid $8.47 for it at the Ralph's register without any memory of walking back inside or standing in line. My receipt was still folded in my jacket pocket. I know because I checked later the way you check small things when the large things have stopped making sense. I passed the street that turned toward my house on Marengo Avenue. I did not take it. I passed the street that would have looped me toward the freeway. I did not take that either. Margaret used to say, I drove the way I wired a house. I always knew where the current needed to go, even when I had not consciously mapped the route. She meant it as a compliment. Standing in the kitchen doorway with a cup of coffee watching me back the truck out of the driveway. At 5 in the morning, she would say it with that particular smile she saved for things she found both useful and slightly funny about me. I had not thought about that smile in several months. It arrived now uninvited and precise in the cab of a truck heading nowhere on Thanksgiving morning. I turned left on Washington Boulevard because the light was green, and it felt easier than stopping. 2 blocks later, I saw the banner. It was strung between 2 wooden posts in front of a low brick building I had driven past 100 times without registering. Community Harvest Center Thanksgiving Meal All Welcome. The lettering was hand-painted in orange and brown, slightly uneven, the kind of sign made by volunteers working on a Wednesday night, rather than a professional with a level and a steady brush. A folding table near the entrance held paper cups and a large coffee urn. 2 women in matching green aprons were arranging covered trays on a cart beside the front door. I sat at the curb with the engine running for longer than I should have. I was not a man who walked into places uninvited. 40 years as an electrician had trained me to respect the difference between a space that needed you and a space that did not. You knocked. You identified yourself. You waited to be told where the problem was before you started pulling wire. But I was holding a chocolate cake that had been intended for a table that had deliberately set itself without a place for me. And through the glass door of that brick building, I could see people moving around, folding tables with the particular efficiency of people who had organized something difficult and were making it work anyway. I turned off the engine. The woman at the entrance introduced herself as a volunteer coordinator and checked the bakery box to make sure the seal was intact. Standard procedure for donated food. She explained health department rules for any public meal service. I told her I understood and signed my name on a donor sheet attached to a clipboard. That was when I noticed the boy. He was standing about 8 feet away, near a bulletin board covered in children's drawings, holding the sleeve of a woman's coat with one fist, the way small children hold on when they are uncertain about a room but unwilling to show it. He looked about 8 years old, dark hair a little too long falling across his forehead. His sneakers were clean, but the left sole had begun to separate at the toe, that particular kind of wear that comes from a shoe used past its natural limit. He was not looking at me. He was looking at the bakery box in the volunteer's hands. His face did something I had not expected. It did not go greedy the way children's faces sometimes go when sweets appear. It went careful, measuring. The way a person looks at something they want very badly but have learned not to reach for without permission. The woman beside him noticed me noticing. She stepped forward and extended her hand. Her grip was firm, the practiced handshake of someone who had spent decades introducing herself in professional settings. "Diana Mercer," she said. "And this is my grandson Noah." She was in her early 70s, I guessed. Neatly dressed in a wool cardigan over a collared shirt, her silver hair pulled back in a way that had probably looked the same for 30 years. There was an exhaustion behind her eyes that had nothing to do with lack of sleep. The specific fatigue of someone who had been solving a problem for too long and had simply become better at not showing it. Noah looked up from the bakery box long enough to study my face with the seriousness that 8-year-old boys reserve for adults they have not yet decided about. "Is that cake?" he asked. "Chocolate," I said. "From the bakery on Colorado." He looked at the box again. His hand tightened slightly on his grandmother's coat sleeve. "Is it really for everybody here?" he asked. The question was so quiet and so careful that I had to lean forward slightly to make sure I had heard it correctly. He was not asking if he could have some. He was asking whether the premise of generosity itself was real, whether a cake that appeared on Thanksgiving morning in a community center actually meant what it appeared to mean, or whether there was a condition attached that would make sense of his grandmother's exhaustion and the temporary quality of everything around them. Diana touched the top of his head gently. "Noah," she said, with the patient firmness of a woman who had said his name that particular way 10,000 times. "No, it's a fair question," I said. I looked at the boy. His left sneaker sole had separated another millimeter when he shifted his weight. "It's for everyone in this room," I told him, "including you. No conditions." Noah's face opened into something so unguarded that it hit me in the sternum like a physical thing. Not excitement relief. Pure, uncomplicated relief, the kind that only appears on a face that has been braced against disappointment for long enough that ordinary kindness has started to feel like a risk. I looked at Diana, then at Noah, who had drifted back toward the bulletin board and was pressing a paper snowflake against the wall with both palms. Noah handed the box back to the volunteer, who carried it toward the tables. He watched it go, then looked up at me. "Is there more?" he asked. "Not today," I said. "But maybe something better." I looked at him directly. "Do you want to change your life, son?" He blinked. 8 years old, standing in a community center in worn sneakers, and he answered without hesitation. "Yes," he said. "I want Grandma to stop worrying." I straightened up and turned to Diana. I told her I might know someone worth talking to. I gave her the name Sandra Okafor and the word cornerstone, and told her to ask her caseworker. I did not promise anything beyond the name. I shook Diana's hand and told her it was good to meet them both. Walking back toward my truck, I passed the folding table with the coffee urn and the paper cups. I poured myself a cup I did not need, and stood there drinking it in the thin November sunlight, thinking about 9 words my son had said to me an hour ago. "Everything was just easier without you there," and about 4 words an 8-year-old boy had just said to me instead. "Is it really real?" My phone buzzed in my jacket pocket. I looked at the screen. Ethan. I pressed the side button and put it face down on the folding table. The coffee was too hot and tasted like it had been sitting since morning, which it probably had. I drank it anyway, standing in the parking lot of a community center on Thanksgiving, because somewhere behind those glass doors a boy named Noah was about to eat chocolate cake and believe, at least for that afternoon, that some things arrived without a price attached. I picked up my phone. I had one call to make, and it was not to my son. The call I needed to make was to Dennis Hobart. Dennis had been my attorney for 11 years, since the week after Margaret was diagnosed, and I realized I needed someone who understood California property law well enough to make sure that whatever happened next, the things we had built together would go where we intended. He was 63 years old, a former public defender who had moved into estate and real estate law after his 3rd decade in court, and he had the particular quality I valued most in anyone I hired to do precise work. He said exactly what he meant and nothing more. His office was closed for Thanksgiving. I knew that before I dialed. I called anyway and left a voicemail that I kept to 4 sentences because Dennis had once told me that any legal instruction longer than 4 sentences was a man preparing his own misunderstanding. I said, "My name is Walter Callum. I am instructing you to halt all steps related to the property transfer of the Willowbrook Lane house effective immediately." No deed delivery, no closing documents, no further action of any kind until I contact you directly. I will follow up in writing within the hour. In California, a property transfer is not complete until a grant deed has been signed, notarized, and recorded with the Los Angeles County Recorder's Office. I had signed nothing. I had notarized nothing. The house on Willowbrook Lane was mine in every legal sense. Every assessment, every tax record, every title document bore my name exclusively. What Ethan and Lauren believed they owned existed entirely inside their own expectations. The law had never confirmed it. I sat in my truck outside the Community Harvest Center and typed a follow-up email to Dennis's office address, copying his paralegal whose name I had in my contacts from the last time we had updated my will. I stated the same 4 instructions in writing and added one line. Please log the time of this correspondence as evidence of my intent. Then I put my phone in my jacket pocket, started the truck, and drove home. The envelope was still on my kitchen table where I had left it that morning. I stood in the doorway of the kitchen for a long moment looking at it. It was a standard white business envelope, the kind sold in a box of 50 at any office supply store. I had written Ethan and Lauren on the front in my block handwriting. Inside were 2 pages explaining the gift, the purchase price, the address, the timeline I had planned for the formal transfer. The reason I had chosen that particular house on that particular street. I had written a paragraph near the end about Margaret, about how she had once described the kind of house she hoped they would all grow old near. Close enough to visit without it being an obligation, far enough to be a choice. I had found Willowbrook Lane because of that paragraph. I had driven past it 17 times before I made an offer because I wanted to be certain it was the right street. I picked up the envelope and put it in the kitchen drawer next to the measuring tape and the takeout menus. Then I put the kettle on because my hands needed something to do. My phone rang at 2:14 in the afternoon. Ethan's name filled the screen. I let it ring twice before I answered. He was already shouting when the call connected, not the climbing architecture-losing shout of a man running out of patience, but the immediate full-volume shout of a man who had been holding something back for 3 hours and had stopped seeing any reason to continue. "What did you do?" His voice hit the cab of my truck like something with physical weight. "I just got off the phone with Dennis Hobart's office. What did you do, Dad?" "His paralegal," I said. "Dennis is with his family." "What did you do?" "I instructed him to stop the property transfer," I said. "Nothing about the house has been recorded or signed. I exercised my right as the owner of the record to halt the process." "You can't just—" He stopped. I heard him pull a breath through his nose the way he had since he was a teenager, when something had not gone the way he planned. "Dad, we have been planning around that house for months. Lauren has paint swatches. We talked to a contractor about the kitchen." "You talked to a contractor about a kitchen in a house that was never legally yours," I said. "I never signed a deed. I never filed a transfer. I told you what I intended to do. I did not do it yet." "Because we trusted you." His voice cracked on the word trusted in a way that I recognized, not grief, not genuine hurt, but the sound a person makes when they have reached for an emotion they believe will be persuasive. "We made plans based on your word, Dad. That means something." "Or my word," I said. "You want to talk about what words mean." The silence on his end lasted exactly long enough for me to understand he had not expected me to say that. "Ethan," I said, "you told me this morning that everything was easier without me there. You said that at 11:47 a.m. while I was standing in a grocery store holding a cake I had bought for your table. You planned Thanksgiving without me and did not call. You moved the date and did not tell me. And now you want to have a conversation about what my word means to you. That is completely different. It is not different, I said. It is the same thing. You decide what counts and what does not count based on what is convenient for you at the time you are deciding. His voice shifted again. The manufactured calm dropped away, and what replaced it was rawer, less prepared, and for a moment I thought I was going to hear something real. Then Lauren said something sharp in the background, and the rawness closed back over. You are doing this to punish us, Ethan said. I am doing this, I said, because the house is mine. Because it has always been mine. And because I am 68 years old, and I have earned the right to make decisions about what I spent 40 years building without asking your permission first. So that's it. His voice climbed, now losing its architecture entirely. You're just taking it back. Like it's nothing. Like we're nothing. My throat tightened, not with guilt, but with something older and harder to name. The specific grief of a parent who recognizes that the child they are speaking to and the child they raised are not the same person and cannot identify exactly when the distance between those two people became permanent. You told me I wasn't wanted at your table, I said. I'm asking the same question back. What exactly is it that you want from me, Ethan? He did not answer, not because he had nothing to say. His breath was audible, uneven, the sound of a man sorting through options. But none of the options available to him were honest ones, and even Ethan at his worst seemed to understand that an honest answer to that question would end something that could not be unended. We'll come over, he said finally. Tonight. We'll talk in person. No, I said. I had not planned to say it. The word arrived fully formed without hesitation, the way the right wire gauge arrives to mind before you have consciously calculated the load. Not tonight, I said. I'll be in touch when I'm ready. I ended the call. I stood in my kitchen with the kettle beginning to whistle and the drawer closed over the envelope I had written for people who had already decided to celebrate what was inside it without the man who put it there. Ray Kowalski showed up at my door at 4:30 with a foil-covered plate and the expression of a man who already knew more than he was going to say right away. That was Ray's way. He had lived 3 houses down from me on Marengo Avenue for 22 years, and in 22 years I had learned that he never arrived at your door without a reason, and never stated that reason before he had eaten something. His wife Carol had passed 2 years before Margaret, and since then the two of us had developed the particular friendship of widowed men in their late 60s. Mostly practical, occasionally honest, never sentimental, unless one of us had been drinking, which on Thanksgiving afternoon was not outside the realm of possibility. Carol used to make this the night before, he said, holding out the plate. Sweet potato casserole. I made it this morning. It's not as good as hers, but it's hot. I stepped back from the door and let him in. We ate at the kitchen table because that is where people eat in a house like mine. Ray took the chair that had been Margaret's for 30 years, without knowing it had been Margaret's, which was fine. I had stopped assigning grief to furniture sometime in the 2nd year. He did not ask me how Thanksgiving had gone. He served himself a portion of casserole with the large spoon he had brought, because he knew I never had the right serving utensils for anything. And he ate with the focused attention of a man who respected food enough not to talk through it. I appreciated that. I had spent enough of the day with words that had done damage. Silence that was chosen rather than imposed felt like something close to mercy. It was Ray who broke it eventually. He set his fork down, pushed the plate 2 inches forward in the way that meant he was done eating and ready to talk, and looked at me across the kitchen table with the directness that had always been the most useful thing about him. Ethan called me, he said. My hand stopped moving toward my water glass. Sham, this morning. Ray continued. Before noon. He wanted to know if I had seen you leave the house, whether you seemed upset. He paused. He used the word unstable. The word landed in the kitchen like something dropped from a height. Unstable, I repeated. Dude, that was his word. Ray's jaw tightened slightly. He had a broad face deeply lined from 40 years of outdoor work. And when something offended him, his expression did not perform the offense. It simply settled into a stillness that was more unsettling than anger. I told him I hadn't seen you and asked why he was calling a neighbor instead of his father. He said you weren't answering his calls and he was concerned. I thought about the 2:47 p.m. call I had answered. The one before that I had declined in the parking lot of the community center. Ethan had called Ray Kowalski between those two calls, had called my neighbor to ask whether I seemed mentally compromised, and had framed that inquiry as concern. He's been doing that for a while, Ray said. Calling around, asking questions about you. I should have told you sooner. I want you to know I'm telling you now because I think you need the full picture of what you're dealing with. I looked at the sweet potato casserole cooling in its foil pan and thought about the word unstable and what a person might do with that word if they had a long enough timeline and the right attorney. What kind of questions? I said. Ray folded his hands on the table. About your memory. Whether you repeated yourself, whether you seemed confused about dates or money, whether you'd mentioned changing your will. He met my eyes. He asked me once whether I thought you were capable of making sound financial decisions on your own. The kitchen was very quiet. The refrigerator cycled on with its low mechanical hum. Outside, someone on the block was setting off early fireworks, which was wrong for Thanksgiving, but happened every year anyway, because some people in Pasadena treated every holiday as an opportunity for the same celebration. He asked you that, I said. About 8 months ago, Ray said. I told him you were the sharpest man on the block, and that if he was worried about your finances, he should try paying for something himself for once. He said it without heat, the way you state a fact you have held for a long time. Walter, I've watched that boy operate for 20 years. I watched you pay off his car loan in 2019 and tell Margaret it was a gift. I watched you cover his deposit on the Sycamore Drive house and tell everyone at the block party you were just helping him get started. I watched him stand in your driveway last Easter and complain that your truck was an embarrassment to park next to his car. My chest did something complicated. Not surprised the facts Ray was describing were ones I already knew individually. What I had not done was hear them assembled by someone else in sequence one after another without pause, the way you see a wiring diagram whole instead of wire by wire, and suddenly understand why the circuit has been failing for years. He told Lauren's family you bought the Willowbrook house as an investment, Ray said. That you were putting it in his name for tax purposes. That's how he explained it to them at their Easter dinner. Ray's eyes did not leave my face. I heard that from Carol Pemberton 2 doors down. Lauren's mother called her because they're in the same garden club. Lauren's family thinks you set this whole thing up as a financial arrangement, not a gift. An arrangement that benefits you. I pushed my chair back from the table slowly, the way you move, when your legs are not entirely certain they will hold you. For 4 years, I had saved and deferred and driven a truck with a failing air conditioner through 3 Pasadena summers because I wanted to give my son something permanent. I had imagined his face when I handed him the envelope. I had imagined him calling his mother's name the way he used to when he was small, and something good had happened, that particular shout, half announcement and half gratitude, that Margaret had loved more than almost any sound he made. He told people it was a tax arrangement, I said. That's what Carol Pemberton said. I stood and walked to the kitchen window. The backyard was the same backyard it had always been. The lemon tree Margaret had planted in 2003 that had never produced a single lemon, which she had found funnier every year. The electrical conduit running along the back fence that I had installed myself and had been meaning to replace for 6 years. Everything ordinary and unchanged, Raymond and I said without turning around. Did he ever once in 20 years say anything to you about me that was generous? Ray took his time with the answer. That was how I knew he was taking it seriously. He told me once that you were the best electrician he'd ever seen, Ray said. He was 17. He said it because you'd just fixed something at his school that 3 other contractors had failed to fix, and his friends were impressed. A pause. I don't think he's said anything generous about you since. I turned around. Ray was looking at me with the steady expression of a man who had decided that honesty at this point in both their lives was the only thing worth offering. There's something else, he said. About Marcus. My brother's name in Ray's mouth stopped me completely. What about Marcus? I said. Ray looked at his folded hands, then back at me. Ethan told you Marcus stopped calling because he was jealous of what you'd built, Ray said. Didn't he? My throat went dry. That's what Ethan told me, I said slowly. 4 years ago. Ray nodded, the nod of a man confirming something he had hoped was not true. Marcus called me 6 months after you two stopped talking, Ray said. He wanted your address because you'd changed your number. He said Ethan had called him and told him you didn't want contact anymore, that you'd said he was toxic and you needed distance. Ray's voice was careful and even. Marcus believed him, Walter. He believed his nephew over his own brother because why would a son lie about something like that? The fireworks outside went off again 3 in a row, closer than before. I sat back down at the kitchen table because standing was no longer something I was doing on purpose. Ray left at 5:15, taking the foil pan with him and leaving me with the kind of quiet that has weight to it. I sat at the kitchen table for 11 minutes. I know it was 11 minutes because the clock above the stove has a second hand that Margaret chose specifically because she said a kitchen clock without a second hand was a clock that did not take cooking seriously, and I had watched that second hand make 11 complete rotations before I picked up my phone and searched my contacts for a number I had not dialed in 4 years. Marcus Callum, San Diego. The number was still there. I had never deleted it. I had told myself in the months after we stopped speaking that I kept it because you did not delete your brother's number the same way you did not throw away a tool you no longer used. It cost nothing to keep, and you could never fully predict when you might need it again. The honest version was simpler. I had kept it because deleting it would have meant accepting that the distance was permanent, and some part of me had never fully accepted that. He picked up on the second ring. Walter. His voice was the same, deeper than mine, slower, with the particular unhurried quality of a man who had spent 30 years in San Diego and absorbed its pace into his bones. For a moment I could not speak because his voice sounded so exactly like itself, and I had not heard it in 4 years. And I had not understood until this moment how much of my own history lived inside the sound of my brother's voice. Marcus, I said. Ray Kowalski told me something tonight that I need to ask you about directly. A pause. Ray Kowalski. Another pause longer. Okay. Ask. Did Ethan call you 4 years ago and tell you I said I didn't want contact with you anymore? The silence that followed was not the silence of a man deciding whether to answer. It was the silence of a man understanding in real time the shape of something he had been living inside without knowing its name. He told me you said I was toxic, Marcus said. His voice was careful in the way voices get when they are managing something large. that you needed distance, that Margaret's death had made you reassess certain relationships, and you had decided mine was one that wasn't healthy for you. He stopped. He called me from your number, Walter. Your cell number. I had no reason to think it wasn't you. My hand tightened around the phone until I felt the case flex slightly under my fingers. Ethan had called my brother from my phone. He had waited until I was out of the house. I could not reconstruct exactly when, but there had been periods in those first months after Margaret died when Ethan had been at the house, frequently helping with paperwork, sitting with me in the evenings, picking up prescriptions. I had given him the entry code. I had trusted him with the unrestricted access of a son in a house of grief. He had used my phone to call my brother and speak in my voice and dismantle the one relationship in my family that had existed before Ethan himself did. I need to sit down, Marcus said. I am sitting down. But I need a moment. Take it, I said. I heard him breathing. I heard what might have been his wife's voice somewhere in the background asking something, and Marcus saying quietly, "Give me a minute, Renee." Then he came back. I wrote you 3 letters, he said. Paper letters because I thought maybe you'd blocked my number. I sent them to Marengo Avenue. I never received them, I said. No, Marcus said. I don't suppose you did. We were both quiet with that for a moment. Ethan had been coming to the house regularly in those months. The mail came to a box at the end of the driveway that I rarely checked, because Margaret had always gotten the mail, and I had still not rebuilt that habit. 3 paper letters from my brother in San Diego, arriving during the period when I was least capable of noticing what was missing, intercepted or destroyed by the son I had trusted with the entry code to my home. And there's something else, Marcus said. Something I didn't fully understand at the time, but I think I understand now. He cleared his throat. About 8 months ago, Ethan called me again. Different tone, friendly, checking in. He asked about you. How I thought you were doing. Whether I'd noticed any changes in you. A pause. He used the phrase cognitive decline. He asked whether I thought you were still sharp enough to be managing your own finances. He asked it the way you ask something when you already have an answer prepared, and you're just collecting supporting statements. The refrigerator hummed. Outside, the fireworks had finally stopped. In California, a conservatorship is a legal arrangement in which a court appoints a person called a conservator to manage the finances or personal care of someone deemed unable to do so themselves. It is designed to protect vulnerable adults. It requires a petition, a court hearing, and medical evidence of incapacity. It is also, in the wrong hands, a mechanism by which a family member can attempt to seize legal control of another person's assets by first establishing a paper record that the person is mentally unfit to manage them. Ray had told me Ethan asked the neighbors about my memory and my financial decisions. Marcus had just told me Ethan had asked him about cognitive decline. Ethan had also, 3 months ago, offered to pay for a comprehensive medical evaluation for me, and had seemed puzzled when I declined, saying I had my own doctor and my own insurance, and did not need help scheduling an appointment. I had thought it was concern. I had told Ray it was concern. I had been grateful for what I interpreted as a sign that my son was paying attention to my health. He was building a file, I said. That's what it sounds like, Marcus said. I walked to the kitchen window again. The lemon tree was dark in the backyard, just a shape against the fence. Margaret had planted it the spring Ethan turned 9. She had said every yard needed one thing that was purely optimistic, something you planted, not because you were certain it would produce, but because you believed in the general direction of growth. The tree had never given us a single lemon. We had loved it anyway. Marcus, I said. I'm sorry I didn't call sooner. I'm sorry I believed what he told me without Walter. His voice cut through mine without harshness. You were grieving. You were in the worst year of your life, and your son told you something, and you had no reason to think he would lie about it. That's not a failure. That's just being human. My eyes burned. I pressed the back of my wrist against them hard, the way you press against a circuit you need to isolate before you can work on it safely. I need to tell you about the house, I said. Ray mentioned something, Marcus said. Tell me yourself. I told him. All of it, the 4 years of saving the purchase, the envelope on the kitchen table, the phone call from the grocery store. The 9 words. I told him about Dennis Hobart and the halted transfer and the 214 call and Ethan's voice climbing out of its careful architecture when the answer he expected did not come. Marcus listened without interrupting. That had always been the thing about my brother that I had most taken for granted, his ability to hold space for a long story without filling the gaps with himself. When I finished, he said one thing. What do you need from me right now? My throat tightened for the second time that evening, differently from the first. The first time had been grief sharpened by betrayal. This was older than that. This was the feeling of being asked simply and without condition what you needed by someone who had known you since before you knew yourself. I need to know you're still there, I said. I'm here, Marcus said. I've been here. I just didn't know you still needed me to be. Outside on Marengo Avenue, a car moved slowly down the block, with its windows down, trailing the faint sound of a Thanksgiving football game from its radio. Ordinary life continuing in all directions, indifferent to the conversation happening in my kitchen. Come up this weekend, I said. I have a lot to show you. I'll be there Saturday morning, he said. I'll bring Renee. I said goodnight to my brother for the first time in 4 years and stood in the kitchen holding the phone against my chest. After the call ended, the way you hold something you had thought was gone and have just been handed back. I did not sleep on Thanksgiving night. That is not unusual for me in the way it might sound. Since Margaret passed, I have had a complicated relationship with sleep that her doctor described as adjustment insomnia, and that I described as lying in the dark, thinking about everything I forgot to say to someone who can no longer hear me. Most nights I was asleep by 10 and awake again by 2, and I had learned to use the hours between 2 and 5 the way I used the early hours of a job site before the rest of the crew arrived quietly, productively, without needing anyone else present to justify the work. That night the work was different. I sat in the armchair in the living room, with my phone on the side table and the floor lamp turned to its lowest setting, the one Margaret had called the reading light, even though neither of us had used it for reading in 20 years. I had opened Ethan's Instagram page without fully deciding to. I had not looked at it in months, maybe longer. I was not a man who spent time on social media, but I had created an account 3 years ago because Margaret's sister had posted photos of a family reunion, and I had wanted to see them, and the account had remained dormant since. Ethan's page loaded slowly on my phone screen. 41 posts. The most recent was from 2 days ago, Wednesday, the day before Thanksgiving, the evening of the dinner that had not included me. There were 9 photographs. I enlarged the first one with my thumb and forefinger, the way Noah had enlarged that second, at his age when he encountered something he needed to see more clearly. The photo showed the dining room of the Sycamore Drive house, the table extended with the extra leaf Ethan had bought the previous spring, set with Lauren's good dishes, candles burning, the kind of careful arrangement that takes an hour and is meant to look effortless. Around the table were 11 people. Lauren's parents, her sister and brother-in-law. 3 couples I recognized as Ethan's friends from the neighborhood. An older woman I did not know who was laughing at something outside the frame. I looked at every face in that photograph twice. My name was in the caption, grateful for the people who fill our table and our lives. So much to look forward to in the year ahead. The next photo was a close-up of Lauren's centerpiece, dried wheat stalks, and small orange gourds arranged in a wooden bowl that I recognized because I had made that bowl in 1987 in a woodworking class Margaret had signed us up for when Ethan was 2 years old. She had said every house needed something handmade in it. I had given the bowl to Ethan when he moved into the Sycamore Drive house because he had always liked it, and because I had more things than I needed, and he was just starting out. My handmade bowl was in the center of the table at a Thanksgiving dinner I had not been invited to. It was in the background of 5 of the 9 photographs. The 7th photograph was the one that stopped my breathing for a full 3 seconds. It showed Ethan standing in the living room with his arm around Lauren, both of them smiling directly at the camera, the Willowbrook Lane listing brochure visible on the coffee table behind them. The brochure the real estate agent had given us during our first walkthrough. The one with the address and the listing price printed in large font on the front page. Someone had taken the photo with the brochure deliberately positioned. Ethan was not looking at the brochure. He did not need to. The brochure was there to be seen by whoever was looking at the photograph. I put my phone face down on the side table and pressed my palms against my thighs and stared at the dark window across the room. The next morning, I drove to the Sycamore Drive house. I had 2 boxes of my own tools in Ethan's garage, a voltage tester and a set of Klein screwdrivers I had lent him 18 months ago when he was installing ceiling fans, and had called me because he did not own a single piece of electrical equipment, despite having grown up watching me use it. I had told him I would pick them up eventually. Eventually had become a year and a half. I rang the doorbell. Lauren answered. She was dressed already, which surprised me. It was 9:15 on the Friday after Thanksgiving, and I had half expected neither of them to be conscious. She wore the particular expression she used when she was recalibrating quickly, the expression that preceded her being gracious in a situation she had not prepared for. "Walter?" She said my name with the bright surprise of someone who has been expecting a call and received a knock instead. "We weren't expecting you. I came for my tools," I said. "The Klein set and the voltage tester. They're in the garage." She opened the door wider, and I stepped into the entry hall. The house smelled like coffee and the specific warm vanilla scent Lauren diffused through the rooms on weekends. The living room was visible from where I stood, and I could see the coffee table. The listing brochure was gone, which told me it had been a prop and props got cleared after the performance. Lauren led me through to the garage. I found my toolbox on the shelf where I had left it, exactly where I always left tools at a job I intended to return to. I lifted it down and checked the contents: voltage tester, present, Klein set. Present the small roll of electrical tape I had forgotten I left there. I was turning to leave when I saw the hallway. The wall between the garage door and the kitchen had always held 3 framed photographs since Ethan and Lauren moved in. I had noticed them without examining them on previous visits. Now, for a reason I could not have articulated precisely, I stopped and looked. The first frame held a wedding photo, Ethan and Lauren at the altar, both of them bright with the particular joy of people who believe the hardest part is now over. The second frame held a photo from Lauren's parents' anniversary dinner, the whole Hartwell family arranged on a restaurant patio. The third frame, the one closest to the kitchen door, the one I was most familiar with because I had the same photograph in a different frame on my own bookshelf, had been the photo from Ethan's college graduation. He was in his cap and gown, and I was standing next to him with my arm around his shoulder and my face doing something I rarely allowed my face to do in photographs. That frame now held a different photograph. Lauren's family at what appeared to be a lake house, summer light, everyone squinting pleasantly into the sun. My graduation photograph with my son had been removed from his wall and replaced with a picture of people I had met twice. I stood in that hallway with my toolbox in my hand and understood something that no conversation, no phone call, no Instagram post had made as clear as this one small rectangle of empty space where my face used to be. Ethan had not excluded me from Thanksgiving, because of a scheduling conflict, or a difficult season, or a temporary frustration with my behavior. He had been removing me systematically and incrementally from the architecture of his life for long enough that a blank space on a wall looked like an improvement. Lauren appeared in the kitchen doorway. "Did you find everything?" she asked. I looked at the wall. I looked at her. She followed my eyes to the empty space where the graduation photograph had been, and something moved across her face, not guilt exactly, more like the expression of someone who has been caught doing something they had decided in advance was justified. "It needed updating," she said. "Of course," I said. I carried my toolbox out through the garage and put it in the back of my truck and sat behind the wheel in the Sycamore Drive driveway for a long moment. Looking at the front of the house I had helped Ethan buy through the window of a truck he had called an embarrassment, holding on to the steering wheel with both hands because the alternative was putting them over my face, and I was not going to do that in his driveway. I started the engine and drove home. The text message arrived at 2:17 in the afternoon while I was underneath the kitchen sink replacing a compression fitting that had been weeping water for 3 weeks. I had started the repair job at noon because I needed to do something that required both hands and a specific problem with a specific solution. Plumbing was not my trade, but I had done enough of it over 40 years to know that a compression fitting was a compression fitting, and that the satisfaction of stopping a leak was available to anyone willing to lie on a cold floor with a wrench. The leak stopped at 1:54. I stayed under the sink for another 20 minutes anyway, because the floor was cool and the cabinet smelled like pipe compound and old wood, and it was easier to think in a small enclosed space than in the middle of a room with too many directions to look. I was at the Thanksgiving dinner Wednesday night. I have been thinking since then about whether to contact you, and I decided I needed to. I'm sorry to reach out this way. Would you be willing to talk? I read the message twice on the floor of my kitchen with a wrench in my hand and a wet patch spreading on the knee of my work pants. I sat up, typed back one word yes, and gave her my number. She called 4 minutes later. Her voice was younger than I had expected from the formality of the text, and there was a tension in it that I recognized as the specific discomfort of someone doing something they believe is right and are not certain they will be thanked for. "Mr. Callum," she said, "thank you for picking up." "Walter," I said. "What did you want to tell me?" A short pause. I could hear her exhale. "I've worked with Ethan for 2 years. He's talked about you, about the house, about what you were planning to give him. He talked about it the way people talk about something that's already theirs." Another pause. "3 weeks ago, he told the whole sales floor that the transfer was basically done, that he was already planning renovations. He said," she stopped. "I'm going to tell you exactly what he said because I think you deserve the exact words." Go ahead," I said. "He said, and I'm quoting, 'the old man's finally doing something useful with his savings.' That was how he described it, to 12 people in an open office." Her voice tightened. "I have a father, Mr. Callum. He is 66. He worked construction his whole life." When Ethan said that, I smiled because everyone else was smiling, and I am not proud of that. But I have been thinking about it since Wednesday night, and I cannot let it sit. I was standing at the kitchen counter with the wrench still in my hand. I set it down on the dish towel Margaret had kept folded over the oven handle, the one with the faded roosters on it, that I had never replaced, because it was still functional, and because throwing it away felt like a decision I had not been asked to make. "What happened Wednesday night?" I said. "At the dinner," she took a breath. "Ethan gave a toast, midway through the meal after the first round of drinks. He stood up and talked about the year, about his work, about Lauren, about everything going well. A pause. He talked about the house, about Willowbrook Lane. He described it as something he and Lauren had worked toward, a goal they had achieved together. He raised his glass and said, "Next year we'll be hosting this in our new place." Her voice was quiet and steady. He used the word "our." He said we worked toward it. There were 12 people in that room, Mr. Callum. Not one of them heard your name. The kitchen was very still. I thought about 4 years of 7 a.m. starts, and skipped vacations, and a truck with 200,000 miles, and a savings account I had looked at every January and told myself was almost enough, almost enough, almost enough. I thought about the envelope on the kitchen table I had written in my block handwriting. I thought about the paragraph about Margaret and what she had said about a house close enough to visit, but far enough to be a choice. How he said we worked toward it, I said. Yes, Joelle said. Did anyone ask him about me? Another pause, longer this time. Lauren's mother asked where you were. Ethan said you had other plans, that you preferred a quieter Thanksgiving. A beat. Lauren's mother said that was a shame. Ethan said you were used to it. My hand found the edge of the counter and pressed against it. You were used to it. Not that I was fine. Not that I had chosen something I preferred. That I was used to being without. Used to absence. Used to a table that did not include me. Stated to a room full of people as though it were a known characteristic of mine, like a food preference or a habit Walter doesn't mind. Walter's used to it. Walter will be fine because Walter is always fine, and that is simply what Walter is for. Mr. Callum, Joelle said carefully. Are you still there? Yes, I said. I'm here. I want you to know, she said, that after the toast, when everyone raised their glasses, I put mine down. I don't know if anyone noticed. I couldn't. Her voice wavered slightly. I've been at that company 2 years, and I've heard Ethan talk about you maybe 30 times. I have never once heard him say anything that sounded like gratitude. I thought you should know that from someone who was in the room. I thanked her. I meant it without reservation. Calling someone's parent to tell them their child is not who they believe requires a particular kind of courage that most people locate after the moment has passed and spend years regretting they did not use. After the call ended, I stayed at the kitchen counter for a long time. The compression fitting under the sink was no longer leaking. I had solved that problem at 154, and the solution would hold indefinitely if the fitting had been installed correctly, which it had, because I did not install things incorrectly. That was the nature of the work I had done for 40 years. You did it right, or it failed, and it failing was never an option you chose in advance, because the failure always cost someone else more than it cost you. I had spent 40 years making certain my work would hold. I picked up my phone and opened the Instagram post again. The one with 11 people around the table and the wooden bowl I had made with my own hands in 1987, and the listing brochure positioned like a prop, and the caption that read so much to look forward to in the year ahead. I looked at the timestamp. Wednesday, 8:47 p.m. At 8:47 p.m. on Wednesday, I had been in this kitchen eating leftover soup from a can and watching the news and thinking about which tie to wear to Thanksgiving dinner the next day, because Margaret had always said you did not show up to someone's table without making an effort, and I had still not stopped listening to her. At 8:47 p.m. my son had been standing in his dining room, raising a glass to a house he did not own. Describing to 12 people work he had not done, receiving congratulations for a future that existed entirely because of a man he had described to his co-workers as finally doing something useful. I closed the app. I opened my contacts and scrolled to Dennis Hobart's number. It was Friday afternoon. His office would be open. I had additional instructions to give him beyond halting the transfer. What came next required a different kind of conversation, not about stopping something, but about building something new from the same materials in a different direction entirely. I pressed the call. Dennis picked up on the first ring. "Walter," he said, "I was expecting to hear from you." "I have some questions," I said, "about what it would take to put a property into a long-term use agreement with a nonprofit housing organization." A brief pause. Then, "That's a different conversation than I was expecting. I like it better." I heard him pull out a chair. "Tell me what you're thinking. If you are listening to this story from the Dad's Revenge Stories channel, leave a comment with the number 1 so I know you are still here and following Walter's journey. Because what I discover next about the things Ethan said behind my back will change everything. And please note, the story that follows contains some fictional elements and may not be completely true in real life. If you do not want to listen to stories like this, you can turn off the video right here. Marcus arrived at 9:40 Saturday morning in a gray Subaru I did not recognize, which meant he had bought a new car sometime in the 4 years we had not spoken. And that small fact hit me in a way I had not anticipated, the accumulation of ordinary life events I had missed. Because my son had decided my brother and I were more useful to him separated than together. He was thinner than I remembered. His hair had gone fully white, which mine had not yet done, and he moved with the careful deliberateness of a man whose left knee had been repaired twice, and who had learned to negotiate stairs without broadcasting the effort. Renee was beside him, 68 years old, a retired school librarian with silver reading glasses pushed up on her head, and the particular warmth of a woman who had spent 30 years making children feel welcome in a room full of books. She hugged me at the door before Marcus did, which was exactly right and exactly like her. We sat in the kitchen because that was where everything real happened in my house. I had made coffee and bought a box of pastries from the Portos on Brand Boulevard, because Marcus had always been a man who required something to eat during a difficult conversation, and I was not going to make my brother sit through the worst story I had told in years on an empty stomach. Renee poured for all 3 of us without being asked, which was also exactly right. I told Marcus everything I had not covered on the phone. The Instagram photographs, the listing brochure positioned as a prop, the wooden bowl I had made in 1987 serving as Lauren's centerpiece at a dinner that had deliberately excluded the man who made it. The graduation photograph replaced on the hallway wall. Lauren's 2-word explanation, it needed updating, delivered with the expression of someone who had decided in advance that the justification was sufficient and was mildly surprised to be questioned about it. Marcus listened with both hands wrapped around his coffee mug, and his face did the thing it had always done when he was holding something difficult. It went very still, the way a level goes still when a surface is perfectly horizontal, every small fluctuation suspended in service of accurate measurement. When I finished, he said, "The bowl." "Yes," I said. The bowl Mom watched you make." His jaw worked briefly. "She drove you to that class every Tuesday night for 6 weeks because you didn't have a car yet, and Dad needed the truck." "I know," I said. "And it's in Lauren's centerpiece." "In the photograph," I said. "In 9 photographs." Marcus set his mug down with a precision that suggested he was managing the force behind the movement. Renee put her hand over his on the table, not to stop him from anything, but because that is what you do when the person beside you is carrying something you cannot carry for them. We were still at the kitchen table at noon when the doorbell rang. I knew before I opened the door. I do not know how I knew, perhaps the quality of the ring itself, that particular 2-note sequence pressed with the deliberate patience of someone who has rehearsed their arrival rather than simply arriving. Perhaps it was that Ethan knew Marcus was coming, because Ray Kowalski's driveway was visible from the street, and a gray Subaru with San Diego plates was not an ordinary Saturday morning occurrence on Marengo Avenue. Ethan stood on my front porch with a brown paper bag from Trader Joe's and the expression of a man who had decided that arriving with food was the same as arriving with goodwill. Lauren was beside him in a camel-colored coat, her hair down, wearing the version of herself she deployed when she needed to seem approachable rather than impressive. She was holding a small wrapped package with a ribbon on it. A ribbon. Shaktija, Dad, Ethan said. His voice was warm in the manufactured way of someone who has practiced warmth in a mirror. We wanted to come by. We brought some things. He held up the Trader Joe's bag. Thought we could talk. I stepped back from the door. They came into the entry hall and saw Marcus at the kitchen table. Something moved across Ethan's face, fast, involuntary there, and gone in under a second. Not guilt. Recalculation. The expression of a man who has walked into a room expecting a specific configuration and found the pieces arranged differently than planned. "Uncle Marcus," he said, the warmth recalibrated, instantly widening to include the new variable. "I didn't know you were coming up." "I know you didn't," Marcus said. He did not stand. He did not extend his hand. He picked up his coffee mug and held it, and looked at his nephew with the level stillness he had been holding since I told him about the phone call 4 years ago, the one Ethan had made from my number in my voice to dismantle the only brotherly relationship I had left after Margaret died. Ethan set the Trader Joe's bag on the counter. Lauren placed the wrapped package on the entry table with the careful placement of someone who wanted it visible, but did not want to be seen, placing it strategically. "We owe you an apology," Ethan said to me. He said it cleanly, without preamble, which I recognized as the opening of a prepared statement. "Wednesday was handled badly. We should have communicated better about the change of plans. Lauren and I talked about it, and we understand why you're upset." "Do you?" I said. "We do." He nodded with the sincerity of a man who had been told that nodding conveyed sincerity. "And we want to fix it. That's why we're here." Lauren unwrapped the ribbon from the package she had placed on the entry table and held it out toward me. It was a picture frame, new, expensive, the kind sold in sets at a home goods store. Inside it was a photograph I had not seen before. Ethan and me at a backyard barbecue maybe 6 years ago, both of us looking at something outside the frame and both of us laughing. It was a good photograph. I remembered the afternoon it had been taken, but I had not known anyone had captured that moment. "We thought," Lauren said carefully, "that you might like to have this." I looked at the photograph. I looked at my son's face in it, open, unguarded, laughing at something I had said, because I had said something that genuinely struck him as funny in a year before the distance between us had calcified into its current form. "When did you decide to come today?" I asked. Ethan blinked. "This morning. We wanted to." "Dennis Hobart's office sent you a formal notification yesterday afternoon," I said, confirming that the property transfer had been permanently withdrawn and that no future transfer of the Willowbrook Lane property to Ethan Raymond Callum or Lauren Hartwell Callum would be processed without new written instruction from me. I looked at him. "What time did that email arrive?" The warmth in Ethan's face did not disappear. It reorganized, became something flatter and more careful underneath its surface temperature. "Dad." "What time, Ethan?" A pause. Lauren's hand found the counter edge behind her. 3:47, Ethan said quietly. "And what time did you decide to come here today?" The kitchen was very quiet. Renee had her hands in her lap. Marcus had not moved. Ethan's jaw tightened. For a moment I saw beneath the prepared warmth to something raw. Not grief, not genuine remorse, but the specific frustration of a man who has constructed a careful approach and watched it identified before it could be deployed. "We came because we want to fix this," he said. The warmth was gone now. What replaced it was closer to his real voice. "Whatever you think about the timing." "I think the timing," I said, "tells me everything I need to know about the reason." I picked up the picture frame from where Lauren had placed it and looked at it again. My son laughing at a backyard barbecue 6 years ago. It was a true photograph. The moment it captured had been real. That was what made it so precisely the wrong thing to bring. "Keep it," I said. I set it back on the entry table. "It's a good photograph. You should have it." The picture frame sat on the entry table between us, like a verdict nobody had officially read aloud yet. Ethan looked at it. Then he looked at me. Something was moving behind his eyes that I had not seen there in a long time. Not the manufactured warmth, not the recalculating flatness, but something older and less controlled. The expression of a man who has run out of the version of himself he had prepared for this room, and is now standing in front of his father with nothing between them but the actual distance. "You're really going to do this?" he said. "I have already done it," I said. "The house." His voice climbed slightly. "You're really going to take it back over a dinner? Over one dinner, Dad?" "Over 4 years," I said. The dinner was the last item in a sequence. It was not the sequence itself. Lauren moved from the counter toward the entry hall, in the quiet way she moved when she was repositioning rather than retreating, finding a new angle from which to manage whatever was happening. Marcus and Renee had not moved from the kitchen table. I was aware of them the way you are aware of a load-bearing wall, present structural, not requiring acknowledgement to do their work. "We made plans," Ethan said. "We have a contractor scheduled. Lauren has been talking to a designer. We have been telling people for months that this was happening." "Chukianon, you told people," I said, "before I had signed a single document. You told your co-workers 3 weeks ago. You told Lauren's family it was a tax arrangement on my part. You told 12 people at a Thanksgiving dinner I was not invited to that you had worked toward that house without mentioning my name once." I kept my voice even. "You built plans on a foundation that did not legally exist, and now that the foundation has been removed, you want to describe that as me taking something back. You promised us—" "I told you what I intended to do," I said. "There is a difference between an intention and a deed. Ask Dennis Hobart. He will explain it in whatever detail you need." Ethan's hands went to his hips. It was a gesture I recognized from when he was 15 and had been caught in something. He could not talk his way out of the physical posture of a person who has run out of language and is falling back on the architecture of his body to project authority he no longer felt. "You know what your problem is." His voice had a new edge, now unpolished, the tone that came out when the prepared version of a conversation had failed, and what remained was whatever had been underneath it all along. "You have always held things over us. Every single thing you've ever given has come with an invisible string. And the second we do one thing you don't like, you pull it." I looked at my son. I had known this argument was coming, the way, a weather system is coming. Not the exact hour, but the direction and the pressure and the particular quality of the air that precedes it. I had heard versions of it before in smaller rooms, about smaller things. This was the full version, the one he had been constructing for years, from the materials of every time I had said no to something he wanted, or yes to something he wanted, with conditions he found inconvenient. "Let me tell you what I have given you," I said. "Not because I want credit. Because I want you to understand what the invisible string actually looked like." He opened his mouth. I kept going. "Chana, I paid $17,000 toward your college loans in 2009 because you called me from your apartment the week after graduation, and told me you could not make rent and the minimum payment at the same time. I told you it was a gift. I told your mother it was a gift. I told myself it was a gift. I paused. In 2014, when you and Lauren wanted the Sycamore Drive house, you were $4,200 short of the down payment the lender required. I transferred it from my personal savings account on a Tuesday and told Ray Kowalski it was just helping you get started. Ethan's jaw tightened. In 2017, you called me because the transmission on Lauren's car had failed, and the repair estimate was $3,100, and you were between bonuses. I drove to the mechanic in Burbank and paid at the counter and drove home. I did not mention it at Christmas. I did not mention it at any subsequent dinner. I did not put it on a list. I looked at him directly. In 2019, your car loan was 4 months behind, and the lender had begun default proceedings. I paid the outstanding balance $8,600 and told you to set up automatic payments going forward. You told me you would. You did not. Lauren had gone very still near the entry hall. So I have paid your cell phone plan as a family line since 2011 because you asked me to add you when you lost your job that spring, and I never removed you because you never asked me to, and I never thought to bring it up. I kept my voice level and factual, the way I read electrical load calculations, not with emotion because emotion introduced error, but with precision because precision was the only thing that could not be argued with. I have repaired every appliance, every fixture, every piece of electrical work in your house at no charge, because you called, and I came because you were my son, and that is what I knew how to give you. I paused. I babysat your dog for 11 days in 2021 when you and Lauren went to Cabo. You did not ask me if I had plans. You told me the drop-off time. The kitchen was completely silent. Renee had her coffee mug halfway to her mouth and had stopped moving. I am not telling you these things, I said, because I want to be thanked for them. I am telling you because you just described what I have given you as things with invisible strings. And I want you to understand that a string requires 2 ends. One end is the giver. The other end is the person who keeps pulling without looking at what they are pulling from. Ethan's face had gone through several expressions in rapid succession and arrived at something I had not seen on him since he was very young, a kind of stripped-back uncertainty, the expression of someone who has believed a story about themselves for so long that being handed a different version of the same events produces not anger, but a specific vertigo. That is not, he started. Ethan. Marcus's voice came from the kitchen doorway. He had stood up. He was not loud. He did not need to be. Let him finish. Ethan turned toward his uncle. Whatever he saw in Marcus's face, the 4 years of absence, the phone call made from a stolen number, the letters sent to an address they never reached, closed his mouth without a word. I waited to make certain he was done. I loved your mother for 31 years, I said. I worked for 39. I saved for 4 more after that. I did not do any of those things to accumulate leverage over you. I did them because that was the shape my love took, practical, specific, showing up when something needed fixing. My voice held, though it required effort. But love is not the same as entitlement. And the fact that I gave freely does not mean that what I gave became yours to take. Lauren spoke for the first time since the entry hall. Walter, she said. Her voice was different from every version I had heard from her, smaller, less managed, the voice of someone who has just understood that the room they have been performing in has no audience left. We didn't think about it that way. I know, I said. It was the truest thing I said in that entire conversation. I believed her. Not that she was innocent, she was not. But the specific failure she and Ethan had committed was not malice in its purest form. It was the failure of people who had been handed things for so long that the hands doing the handing had stopped being visible to them. They had not seen me. They had seen what I provided. Those two things had collapsed into each other so gradually that by the time I was standing in a grocery store on Thanksgiving morning, my absence from their table had felt to them like a reasonable accommodation rather than an amputation. Ethan sat down on the bottom step of my entry hall staircase. He put his elbows on his knees and his face in his hands, and he stayed there. I did not go to him. I did not hand him anything. I stood where I was and let the room be what it was, a place where the truth had been spoken at full volume for the first time, in longer than either of us could accurately measure, and where nobody was required to make it comfortable before it had finished doing what truth does when you finally stop moving furniture in front of it. Ethan and Lauren left at 2:15 without the Trader Joe's bag. I do not know if that was intentional, or if they simply forgot it in the particular fog that follows a conversation that has gone differently than you planned. Either way, it sat on my kitchen counter for the rest of the afternoon: sourdough bread, a wedge of aged cheddar, a jar of fig, preserves, the specific items a person buys when they want to appear thoughtful without having to think too hard about the actual person they are buying for. I put the cheese in the refrigerator and left the rest on the counter because throwing it away felt wasteful, and eating it immediately felt like something I was not ready to decide about. Marcus and Renee stayed for another hour. We did not talk about Ethan. We had said what needed saying while he was in the room, and repeating it in his absence would have turned grief into gossip, which was a line Margaret had identified early in our marriage, and that I had tried to honor ever since. Instead, Marcus told me about a restaurant in San Diego he and Renee had been going to on Friday nights for 3 years, and Renee told me about a garden she had started in the backyard of their house, and I told them about the lemon tree that had never produced a lemon, and for 45 minutes, we were 3 people sitting in a kitchen, talking about ordinary things, which was its own kind of restoration. When they left, Marcus held me by both shoulders in the doorway, the way our father used to, looking at my face the way you look at something you have been separated from long enough to need to relearn its details. "Saturday after next," he said. "Come to San Diego. Stay the weekend." "I'll be there," I said. I meant it without qualification, which was a different quality of meaning than I had given to most things in the previous 48 hours. I called Sandra Okafor at 3:30. Her name had come from Dennis Hobart, who had given it to me at the end of our Friday afternoon call with the particular endorsement of a man who did not give endorsements casually. He had said Sandra ran the Pasadena office of a nonprofit called Cornerstone Housing Partners, that she had been doing transitional housing placement for 14 years, and that if I was serious about what I had described, she was the right person to talk to first, not because she would tell me what I wanted to hear, but because she would tell me what I needed to know, which was a different and more valuable thing. She picked up on the third ring with the brisk competence of someone for whom Saturday afternoons were working time by choice rather than necessity. "Mr. Callum," she said, after I had introduced myself and mentioned Dennis. He called ahead. "I've been expecting you." "I appreciate you taking the call on a weekend," I said. "Transitional housing doesn't observe weekends," she said. Not bitterly practically, the way an electrician might say that power outages don't observe holidays. "Tell me about the property," I told her. "Single-story bungalow on Willowbrook Lane in Pasadena. 3 bedrooms. Covered back porch. Recently purchased outright, no mortgage title, entirely in my name. In good structural condition, with some cosmetic updating needed. Roughly 1,800 square feet level lot, close to a bus line within the attendance boundary of 2 elementary schools." Sandra asked questions the way good diagnosticians ask questions, not to confirm what she already suspected, but to identify what she did not yet know. She asked about the age of the roof. The HVAC system. Whether the electrical panel had been updated, whether there were any open permits on the property. She asked whether I had a timeline in mind and what my expectations were regarding my own involvement going forward. I answered each question directly. The roof was 11 years old, with a remaining useful life of approximately 8 to 12 years, depending on weather. The HVAC had been serviced 6 months before purchase and was functioning correctly. The electrical panel was a 100-amp service that I intended to upgrade to 200-amp myself before any placement, because 200-amp was the appropriate standard for a modern household, and I was not going to put a family in a house with insufficient capacity. There were no open permits. My timeline was flexible, but my intention was firm. The electrical upgrade, Sandra said. You'd do that yourself. I'm a licensed electrician, I said. 39 years. I have kept my California license current because I was not ready to stop being useful in that specific way. A brief pause. Most donors write a check, Mr. Callum. I know, I said. I've written checks. They don't feel like anything. Another pause, longer. I heard her moving, the sound of a chair adjusting papers, shifting. Cornerstone operates what we call bridge placements. A family comes to us from temporary shelter or an emergency housing situation. They have income potential, one or both adults are employed or actively job-seeking, but they lack the combination of savings, rental history, and deposit funds that the private market requires. We place them in a stable property for 9 to 12 months. During that period, they work with a case manager, rebuild savings, and establish the rental history they need to qualify for permanent housing independently. The owner retains title, I said. It was not a question. Dennis had explained the structure, but I wanted to hear her describe it. The owner retains title throughout, Sandra confirmed. We execute a long-term use agreement, a formal contract between the property owner and Cornerstone that specifies the terms of our use of the property, our responsibilities for maintenance and tenant management, and the conditions under which the agreement can be modified or terminated. You would receive regular reports on the property's condition. You would not receive rent. The placement is subsidized through our funding, but you would maintain full legal ownership and all associated tax benefits. What happens to the family after 12 months? I asked. Ideally, they move into permanent housing they have qualified for independently, she said. That is the goal. Our placement success rate for families who complete the full program is 73%, achieving independent permanent housing within 6 months of program completion. A pause. The other 27% require additional support. We do not abandon them. We adjust. I stood at the kitchen window while she talked. The lemon tree was catching the late afternoon light in a way that made it look more productive than it had ever been. Margaret would have pointed that out. She would have said the tree was finally earning its place by looking beautiful in November, which she would have argued was more than most things managed. I want to ask you something, I said. And I want you to answer it the way you would answer a question from a colleague, not from a donor. All right, Sandra said. Is there a risk that doing this, using a property this way, is something I'm considering? Because I'm angry at specific people, and this feels like the opposite of what they wanted. The pause that followed was the pause of a person taking a question seriously. Yes, she said. That risk exists. It exists for every donor who comes to us following a family conflict, a divorce, a death, a falling out of some kind. Reactive generosity is generosity. It still houses families, but it does not always survive the anger cooling. Another pause. The question I ask in those situations is whether the decision makes sense after the anger is gone, not instead of the anger after it. I thought about Diana Mercer's firm handshake. I thought about Noah's sneaker with the separating sole. I thought about the question he had asked in a voice so careful it sounded like a child who had learned not to assume, is it really real? It makes sense after, I said. Then let's schedule a site visit, Sandra said. I'd like to see the property before we go further. Are you available Tuesday morning? I'll make myself available, I said. I wrote down the time she gave me on the same notepad Margaret had used for grocery lists in the same block handwriting I had used for 11 years of my own lists on the page, directly after the one I had carried into Ralph's on Thanksgiving morning. The page that still had cranberry sauce written on it in my own hand from a holiday that had become something I had not expected and could not have planned, and would not, looking back at it from where I was standing now, have chosen to undo. I drove to Willowbrook Lane on Sunday morning before the neighborhood was fully awake. That was intentional. I had learned over 40 years of job sites that the best time to assess a space, honestly, was before other people arrived, to fill it with their expectations of what it should become. An empty room at 7 in the morning told you things about itself that it would not tell you at noon, with a contractor walking through making notes on a clipboard and a client asking about paint colors. The light was different. The sounds were different. The room was only itself without the overlay of what anyone intended to do with it. I parked in the driveway and sat for a moment with the engine off. The brick path to the front door was still the same narrow strip I had walked 11 times since the purchase, twice with Ethan and Lauren, twice with my real estate agent, the rest alone at various stages of the transaction. The frost that had edged the lawn during the weeks I was finalizing paperwork had given way to the particular dry December chill of Pasadena mornings, cold enough to see your breath, but not cold enough to constitute genuine hardship, which was one of the things Margaret had loved about this part of California, and one of the things I had stopped noticing until she was not there to mention it anymore. I unlocked the front door and stepped inside. The house smelled the way empty houses smell. Not unpleasant, just neutral, the absence of the specific combination of cooking and laundry and the particular human occupation that turns a structure into a place where someone lives. The living room caught the morning light through the bay window in a long rectangle across the hardwood floor. I stood in it for a moment, because the light was exactly what it had been described as in the listing, and I had not yet given myself permission to simply stand in a room I owned without an agenda. Then I got to work. I had brought my full diagnostic kit: voltage tester, multimeter, circuit tracer, outlet tester, the worn leather tool roll Margaret had given me for our 20th anniversary, that I had used every working day since and would use until it fell apart, which at the current rate of wear would be some time after I did. I started in the electrical panel, which was mounted in a utility closet off the kitchen hallway. The panel was a 100-amp service, as I had told Sandra. It was functional and code-compliant for its era, installed in the early 1990s, updated once in 2004 based on the permit history I had pulled from the Los Angeles Department of Building and Safety before the purchase closed. In California, a 100-amp service is the minimum acceptable for a residential property, but minimum acceptable and appropriate for a modern household are not the same measurement. A family with a washer, a dryer, a dishwasher, a refrigerator, window, air conditioning units, and the ordinary accumulation of devices that constitute life in 2024 could push a 100-amp service to its limits without doing anything unusual. 200 amps was the right standard. It was also a job I could do myself with the correct permits. In California, electrical work on a residential property requires a permit from the local building department and a final inspection by a city inspector before the work is considered complete and legal. A licensed electrician can pull their own permit, perform the work, and schedule the inspection directly. The process takes longer than writing a check to someone else and asking them to handle it, But it produces work you can stand behind because you did it yourself and you know exactly what is inside every wall. I spent 2 hours tracing circuits. The house had 14 circuits serving the living spaces, plus 2 dedicated circuits for the kitchen appliances, and 1 for the dryer hookup in the laundry closet. The wiring was copper, throughout which was correct aluminum wiring in residential properties, had been a problem in construction from the late 1960s through the mid-1970s, and a house with aluminum branch circuit wiring required specific remediation. This house had none of that. The previous owners had maintained it with the quiet competence of people who understood that a house was a system and systems required attention. What it needed was capacity and grounding improvements in the bathrooms, and 2 new circuits for the kitchen to bring it in line with current code for receptacle spacing. I made notes in a small spiral notebook I kept in my chest pocket. Not Margaret's grocery notepad, a different one, a job notebook. The kind I had kept since my first year as an apprentice, when my foreman had told me that a tradesman who did not write things down was a tradesman who was planning to redo work he had already done once. I wrote measurements, circuit numbers, load calculations, material estimates. The handwriting was the same block print I used for everything. The numbers were exact, because in electrical work, inexact numbers had consequences. By 9:15, I had a complete picture of what the house needed. I stood in the kitchen and looked at the pencil mark on the wall where Ethan had measured for a coffee station during the second walkthrough. He had made it with a casual authority, the mark of a man staking out territory in a space he had already decided was his. I had watched him make it and felt something I had not examined at the time, a small displacement, a minor keynote in a chord that was otherwise major gone before I identified it. I rubbed at the mark with my thumb the way I had done once before, standing in this kitchen after Thanksgiving, trying to understand how possession had replaced gratitude so completely that my son could mark a wall he did not own, as though the marking itself constituted ownership. The mark came off. Pencil on flat paint, nothing permanent. The wall underneath was clean and unmarked, the same color it had been before he touched it. I put my hand flat against the wall where the mark had been. This was what I had bought. Not for Ethan's coffee station or Lauren's new backsplash or the renovation plans they had described to a contractor before a single piece of paper had been signed. I had bought it because I had wanted to give someone something permanent. That intention had not changed. The person it was meant for had. My phone buzzed. A text from Ray. "Saw your truck on Willowbrook this morning. You doing okay over there?" I typed back, "Working. Come by if you want coffee." 14 minutes later, Ray's car appeared in the driveway. He let himself through the unlocked front door, the way people do when they have been friends long enough to understand that an unlocked door on a job site is an invitation. He found me in the kitchen reviewing my circuit notes. He looked at the notebook, then at the panel closet I had left open, then at the outlet tester still sitting on the counter. 200 amp upgrade, he said. "Tuesday I have a site visit with the housing organization," I said. "I want the assessment done before Sandra sees the panel." Ray picked up my outlet tester and turned it in his hand the way tradesmen handle tools, not casually, with the specific attention of someone who knows what the object is for. "You want help pulling the permit?" I looked at him. Ray had his California electrician's license. He had let it lapse 2 years ago because he had told himself he was done with the work. He had kept the reference manuals on his shelf, I knew, because I had seen them there every time I sat in his kitchen, arranged with the spines facing out, the way a man arranges books he intends to return to. "You'd have to reinstate it," I said. "I know," he said. "I looked into it last night." A pause. "Takes about 3 weeks. Fee is $80. He set the outlet tester down on the counter with the same precision Marcus had used, setting down his coffee mug the day before, controlled deliberate the gesture of a man who has made a decision and is done deliberating about it. I've got time, and this seems like something worth being licensed for. My throat did the thing it had been doing periodically since Thanksgiving, tightening without warning in the specific way of a man who has received more genuine kindness in 4 days than he had recognized in 4 years. 3 weeks, then, I said. 3 weeks, Ray said. In the meantime, I can hand you things and hold the flashlight. I laughed. It came out of me without preparation, real and sudden, the way laughter does when you have been carrying something heavy long enough that the muscles required for it have forgotten their original purpose and then abruptly remember. Ray looked mildly pleased with himself, which was exactly the right response. Coffee's in the thermos, I said. Cups are in my bag. Sandra Okafor arrived at Willowbrook Lane at 9 Tuesday morning in a dark green Honda that had seen considerable use and was not apologetic about it. She was shorter than I had imagined, from her voice on the phone, 5'4", maybe 5'5", with the kind of contained physical energy that belongs to people who move through demanding days without wasting motion. She wore a practical wool coat over a collared shirt and carried a leather portfolio that had the worn corners of something used daily for years. She shook my hand at the front door with the same grip she probably used in courtrooms and community board meetings, and the occasional difficult conversation with a property owner who had changed their mind firm brief informational. Mr. Callum, she said. Walter, I said. Come in. Ray was already inside. He had arrived 30 minutes earlier with his own coffee and a legal pad, which he said was for taking notes, and which I suspected was also because he had not been inside a property assessment in 2 years and had missed it more than he had admitted to himself. Sandra acknowledged him with the nod of a professional who was accustomed to finding various supporting parties at site visits and had long ago stopped being surprised by the configurations people assembled around important decisions. She moved through the house the way I had moved through it Sunday morning, systematically, without rushing, pausing in doorways to assess proportions before entering rooms. She opened closets. She tested every outlet with a small tester she produced from her portfolio. She looked at the panel, noted the 100-amp service without comment, and wrote something on her legal pad. She checked the water pressure in both bathrooms by running the tap and the shower simultaneously. She opened the back door and stood on the covered porch for a full minute looking at the yard. I did not narrate the house for her. I had learned early in my career that the most useful thing you could do while a competent person assessed something was stay out of their way and answer questions when asked. She asked 3. Was I aware the hot water heater was approaching the end of its expected service life? Yes, I had noted it and planned to replace it before any placement. Was the back fence the property line, or was there additional land behind it, property line confirmed by survey? Had I identified the scope of the electrical upgrade? Yes, and I handed her my circuit notes from Sunday, which she read with the focused attention of someone who understood what she was looking at. She looked up from the notes. You wrote these yourself? Sunday morning, I said. She looked at Ray. And you're helping with the permit and the work. License reinstatement in 3 weeks, Ray said. We'll pull the permit the same day. Sandra made another note. Then she closed the portfolio and stood in the kitchen with her hands folded over it and looked at me with the directness of a person who had decided the assessment was complete and was ready to say what she thought. Charmaine, this property is appropriate for our program, she said. The location is strong bus access, school proximity, walkable to a grocery store on Colorado. The structure is sound. The upgrades you've identified are the right ones, and the fact that you're doing them yourself rather than patching tells me you understand what a family actually needs in a house versus what looks good on a checklist. She paused. I want to be direct with you about what comes next. Please, I said. We will conduct our own inspection through a licensed contractor standard practice, not a reflection on your assessment. That takes approximately 2 weeks. Assuming it confirms what your notes indicate, we'll move to drafting the long-term use agreement. That document will specify that Cornerstone holds operational responsibility for the property for the duration of each placement tenant screening case, management, maintenance coordination, and all direct interaction with the family in residence. She met my eyes. You will not choose the family. I want to be unambiguous about that. Our screening process evaluates every applicant household on the same criteria. Your property goes into the pool. The family that matches the criteria most closely gets the placement. Ooh, that's what I want, I said. She studied me for a moment. Most donors say that initially. I mean it, I said. I met a woman and her grandson at the Community Harvest Center on Thanksgiving. They're the reason I started thinking about this differently. But I don't know their situation well enough to decide they need this more than someone I haven't met. That's your job. I'm not qualified for it. Sandra's expression did not change dramatically. She was not a person given to dramatic expressions, but something in it settled the way a level settles when the bubble finds center. All right, she said. We'll proceed. She left at 10:40. Ray and I stood on the front porch and watched the dark green Honda back out of the driveway with the careful competence of its driver. She's good, Ray said. Yes, I said. My phone rang at 2:17 that afternoon. Ethan's name on the screen no longer produced the complicated, anticipatory dread it had carried for the previous 5 days. It produced something simpler, the flat recognition of a number I knew, and a conversation I was prepared to have or not have, depending on what was on the other end of it. I answered. Dad. His voice was different from Saturday. The rawness that had been underneath his prepared warmth was closer to the surface, now less managed. I need to talk to you about something. Go ahead, I said. A pause. There's a payment that came through on my credit card. A balance transfer I set up through your account 18 months ago. Another pause. The automatic payment from your account didn't process this month. I had known this call was coming since Saturday afternoon, when I had logged into my online banking and systematically removed Ethan's name from every linked account, automatic transfer, and authorized user status I had accumulated over 11 years of what I had called helping, and what I now understood had functioned as an unconditional subsidy. The credit card balance transfer had been Ethan's idea. He had explained it as a smart financial move, moving high-interest debt onto a lower-rate instrument, using my superior credit score as the qualifying factor. I had agreed because the explanation had sounded reasonable, and because I had been in the habit of agreeing to things that sounded reasonable when my son proposed them without examining the habit itself. The automatic payment won't be processing anymore, I said. I removed the authorization last Saturday. The silence on his end lasted long enough to have a shape. Dad, that payment is $4,300 a month. I know what it is, I said. I've been paying it for 18 months. If it doesn't process, the account goes delinquent in 30 days. His voice climbed slightly. My credit score, Lauren's credit score, this affects both of us. I understand the mechanics, I said. Then you understand that this would... He stopped. Started again. You can't just pull that without warning. I thought about Thanksgiving morning in the grocery store. About a phone call that had ended my expectation of sitting at my son's table with 9 words delivered in a voice that found the decision practical. About the difference between warning and consideration, and the specific direction in which both had consistently traveled in our relationship for longer than 18 months. "Ethan," I said, "I'm going to say one thing and then I'm going to let you handle this." He was breathing audibly, waiting. "You have a job," I said. "Lauren has a job. You have a house I helped you buy and a car I helped you keep, and 11 years of financial scaffolding that you have been standing on without looking down to see what it was made of." I kept my voice level. "The scaffolding is coming down. Not because I want you to fail. Because you are 38 years old, and I have been treating you like someone who could not stand without it. And I think we have both been wrong about that for a long time." A long pause. "What are we supposed to do?" he said. Not angry now. Something more undefended than anger. "Call the lender," I said. "Explain your situation. Ask about hardship arrangements. They have the most credit issuers do, and a borrower who calls proactively before a payment is missed is in a significantly better position than one who waits for the delinquency." I paused. "You're a sales manager, Ethan. You know how to make a phone call and negotiate terms. Use what you know." I ended the call. Outside the kitchen window, the lemon tree caught the afternoon light the way it had on Sunday, optimistic and unproductive, and entirely itself. I put the phone in my pocket and went back to my circuit notes. I went back to the Community Harvest Center on the first Saturday of December, without a bakery box and without a plan. I had looked up the volunteer schedule Thursday evening, 9 to noon Saturdays. I drove to Washington Boulevard at 8:50, parked in the same spot as Thanksgiving, and walked through the front door as a man who had some time and wanted to use it usefully. The coordinator handed me a form, a name tag, and disposable gloves. Supply room. Donated winter clothing, sorted by size. I spent 90 minutes organizing coats and children's snow pants into bins labeled with masking tape, which was precise enough work to keep my hands occupied, while the rest of me processed the week I had just lived through. At 10:30, I heard Noah before I saw him. His voice carried from the common area at the volume natural to 8-year-olds, twice what most rooms required. He was explaining to someone why fractions had been designed incorrectly and what he would have done differently. The explanation had the passionate specificity of a grievance that had been carefully prepared. I stepped out of the supply room. Diana sat at a corner table with a library book and a coffee, the posture of a woman who had learned to find stillness in whatever surrounded her. She looked up and recognized me. Noah stopped mid-sentence about numerators and said, "You're the cake man." "That's one way to put it," I said. "Walter," I said to both of them. Noah considered the first name the way children do, then redirected his fractions argument toward me on the theory that a new audience was preferable. When he went to retrieve a worksheet, Diana closed her book. "I wasn't sure we'd see you again," she said. "I wasn't sure either," I said. "On Thanksgiving, I wasn't sure about much." "How are you doing?" "Better," I said. "Clearer." She nodded. Clarity tends to cost something. Noah returned and spread his worksheet across the table with territorial confidence. He had a pencil sharpened down to 3 inches, used with the intensity of someone refusing to acknowledge it was almost gone. Diana caught my eye over his head, with the expression of a grandmother who had heard the fractions argument 17 times. "He's been at the same school since September," she said quietly. "Same teacher, same cubby. Before that, we moved 4 times in 14 months. I thought about what Sandra had said. A stable address. Not beautiful, not spacious. Stable. The kind where a child's backpack is in the same place in the morning it was the night before. 31 years at Huntington Hospital." Diana said when I asked what she had done before. "Pediatric ward." Retired in 2019, the building sold in 2022. New owner raised rent 60% in 12 months. My savings weren't built for that. She said it plainly without asking me to feel anything specific. My daughter is working through some things. Noah is with me, which is where he should be. There's a housing program called Cornerstone Housing Partners, I said. Transitional placements, stable housing 9 to 12 months while families rebuild. I have a property they're evaluating. I looked at her directly. I'm not telling you this as a promise. The program makes its own decisions. I've asked them specifically to keep me out of the process. But it might be worth asking your caseworker about applying. Her hands went still around the coffee cup. You're the owner, she said, not a question. Yes. She sat with that for a long moment, deciding what it meant and what it did not mean, whether the distinction I had drawn between telling and promising was real or polite. If the program selects us, she said finally, it would be because we qualified. Yes, I said, exactly that. Noah looked up from his worksheet with the satisfaction of a child who has argued with mathematics and won. Walter, he said, testing the name. Are fractions ever actually useful in real life? I thought about load calculations, wire gauge ratios, the precise fraction of an inch that determined whether a fitting sealed or wept for 3 weeks. Constantly, I said. I'll show you sometime. He returned to his worksheet. The current was running in the right direction. Ethan chose a coffee shop on Lake Avenue called Provisions. Halfway between our houses, neutral ground, the tactical preference of someone who had run out of home advantage. He was already seated when I arrived. Back to the wall facing the door. A coffee in front of him he was not drinking. His hands were around the cup, the way hands go around something when they need something to hold. I ordered at the counter and sat down across from him. The credit card lender agreed to a hardship arrangement, he said. Reduced minimum payment for 6 months. I called them like you said. Good, I said. Lauren found a second consulting project. We're managing. He looked down at his cup, then back at me. I've been thinking about what you said Saturday, about the scaffolding. I didn't know it was scaffolding. I knew you helped us. I didn't think about the structure of it, what it meant that it was always there. His jaw worked briefly. That's not an excuse. I'm just trying to tell you what I actually understood versus what I should have. It was the most honest thing he had said to me since before Thanksgiving. I noted it without performing a reaction, because performed reactions to honesty teach people that honesty is a performance rather than a requirement. I hear you, I said. Is there any version of this where we come back from it? He asked. As a family. That depends on what you mean by coming back, I said. You want the relationship restored to its previous configuration. I am telling you that configuration is not something I am willing to restore. Not to punish you. Because it was damaging to both of us and neither of us understood that until 10 days ago. So 40 years of being your son means nothing. One Thanksgiving, I said, and 4 years of isolating me from my brother. 8 months of asking neighbors whether I was cognitively declining. 11 years of financial support you described to coworkers as the old man finally doing something useful. The Thanksgiving was not the cause, Ethan. It was the point at which I finally understood what I was looking at. He pushed back slightly from the table. You're never going to forgive me, he said. I already have, I said. He looked at me with open confusion. But forgiveness is not the same as restoration, I said. I forgive you because carrying the alternative is heavier than I am willing to carry. but it does not rebuild the scaffolding. It does not restore automatic access to my time and money and presence, as though the last 10 days did not happen. I leaned forward. What it restores is the possibility of something different, something honest. Where you are my son because you choose to show up as my son, not because I have made it financially comfortable to keep me in your life. He stared at the table. I don't know how to do that, he said. The different version. Neither do I yet, I said. That's the point. We figure it out without a blueprint. That's also what makes it real instead of just comfortable. When he finally looked up, his face had changed. Not resolved, not healed. Just changed the way a room changes when you open a window. No longer sealed. The house on Willowbrook, he said. Is it already decided? Yes, I said, it is. One small nod. The nod of a man accepting a fact rather than an argument. We sat another 10 minutes talking about nothing. The traffic on the 210, the cold snap, a restaurant on Colorado that had changed ownership. Small talk that indicated two people were willing to remain in the same room after something hard had ended. I paid for both coffees on the way out, because some habits take longer to examine than others. Dennis Hobart called on the Thursday before Christmas to tell me the long-term use agreement had been fully executed. 23 pages. Both parties signed, notarized, filed. The title to Willowbrook Lane remained entirely in my name. What I had signed over was not ownership but use. The organized, supervised, case-managed use of a house I still owned by families, selected through a process I had deliberately kept myself out of. Dennis told me to call if anything came up. I thanked him and hung up before he finished the sentence. Then I called Ray. He picked up on the second ring with the alertness of a man who had kept part of his attention near the phone all morning without admitting it. Agreements executed, I said. A brief pause. Then we're working tomorrow. We started at 7 Friday morning. The December air had the quality Margaret had called good working weather, cold enough to be honest, not cold enough to punish you for being outside. I thought about her every time the air felt like that. I had stopped trying not to. Ray was already in the driveway when I pulled up his truck loaded with conduit and wire and the 200-amp panel we had ordered from the supply house on Rosemead Boulevard. He was looking at the roofline the way tradesmen look at a structure before they begin finding the logic of the building, before introducing their own. We worked without needing to talk much. That was the specific pleasure of working alongside someone who knew their trade. The job itself became the conversation. By noon, the old panel was disconnected, and the rough work on the new service entrance was underway. We ate sandwiches on the covered back porch. Ray had brought them in a cooler without mentioning it, which was the kind of thing Ray did. The December sun hit the porch exactly the way the listing had described. Sandra called this morning, I said. Inspection report came back clean. Program is moving to placement evaluation. Families being screened now. Ray looked out at the yard. Diana and the boy. I don't know, I said. I asked Sandra not to tell me who applied or where they rank. If they're selected, I'll know when the placement is announced. If they're not, someone else needed it more. That's the right outcome. You believe that? He asked. Not skeptically, genuinely. Yes, I said. I believe it. Ray folded his wax paper into a neat square the way a man does when the habit has become part of who he is. Then he looked at me directly. Margaret would have been proud of this, he said. Not the house specifically. The way you handled all of it. She used to tell Carol you were the most capable man she'd ever met, but that you had a blind spot about what you deserved. Spent 30 years trying to fix it and wasn't sure she'd made a dent. My throat tightened in the specific way it had been tightening since Thanksgiving. A man who has not cried in front of another person in 6 years and is not going to start now, but whose body retains its own opinion about what is worth crying about. She would have chosen the kitchen backsplash herself, I said, and told Sandra it was a suggestion. Ray laughed. And Sandra would have thanked her and done something completely different. And Margaret would have respected that enormously, I said. We went back inside and finished this work. At 4:30, I stood in the utility closet and looked at the new 200-amp panel on the wall where the old one had been. Same wall, same closet, different capacity, more room for what the house would be asked to carry. The streetlights came on along Willowbrook Lane one by one as we loaded the trucks unhurried, certain the way a neighborhood announces that the day has ended and the people inside have turned their lights on and life is continuing in all its ordinary directions. Sandra called on the second Tuesday of January at 8:43 while I was replacing the hot water heater at Willowbrook Lane. I wiped my hands on my work pants and answered. The placement panel completed its review, she said. The family selected for the first placement is Diana Mercer and her grandson Noah. They ranked first on every qualifying criteria. I want to be transparent, I knew you had met them. I reviewed their file against the next 3 ranked families. The gap was significant. They would have ranked first regardless of your prior contact. I sat down on the edge of the bathtub because my knees had made a decision without consulting me. Thank you for telling me that, I said. Move-in is scheduled for the first Saturday of February, Sandra said. Is the property ready? Hot water heater done by noon today, I said. 200-amp service certified. Ray repaired the back gate last weekend because the hinge had loosened, and he said he wasn't leaving it like that. A brief silence I had come to recognize as Sandra's version of warmth. It always was in good hands, she said. You just had the wrong people in mind for it. After the call, I sat without moving. The supply line dripped onto the utility closet floor with the patient indifference of water following gravity, regardless of what else was happening. I thought about Diana's hands around her coffee cup going still when I mentioned Cornerstone. I thought about Noah and his 3-inch pencil and the way he had said my name like a test he had decided to run. I was not angry. The anger had done its work and left behind something quieter, not peace exactly, but the specific clarity of a man who has stopped arguing with what happened and started deciding what to do about where he is. I finished the hot water heater and went back to work. Move-in day was the first Saturday of February, and I spent it at Ray's kitchen table drinking coffee and not driving to Willowbrook Lane. That required more deliberate effort than I had expected. I knew the move-in was scheduled for 10 in the morning. I knew Sandra's case manager would be there. I knew the program provided a basic household kit, bedding towels, kitchen essentials, because Sandra had described it during our second call. I knew all the things I needed to know, and none of them required my presence to be true. At 10:17, my phone buzzed. A text from Sandra. Family is in. Everything went smoothly. She wanted me to tell you the lights in the tree were the first thing her grandson noticed when they pulled up. I read the message twice. Then I set the phone face up on Ray's kitchen table and looked at it. Ray topped off my coffee without asking. He had read the message from where he was standing. He did not say anything which was exactly right. I thought about Noah noticing the lights. An 8-year-old boy in the back seat of a car on a February morning, pulling up to a house that was going to be his house for the next year, and the first thing his eyes found was a string of lights in a liquid amber tree that 2 old electricians had hung on a January evening because a yard should indicate that a house is ready to welcome someone. He did not know who put them there. He had simply seen them and noticed. That was enough. Thanksgiving came around again, the way it always does, without asking whether you were ready. I was ready. The dinner was at Ray's house because Ray's dining room held 8 people comfortably, and we were 7, Ray Marcus and Renee Sandra, Diana Noah, and me. Nobody had assigned seats. Nobody had coordinated the menu through a single person, who then spent 3 days managing everyone else's contributions. Marcus brought tamales because Renee's family had made them every Thanksgiving for 40 years, and she saw no reason to stop. Sandra brought sweet potato casserole. Diana brought a pie. I brought a chocolate cake from the bakery on Colorado Boulevard. Noah saw it when I came through the door, and his face did the thing it had done at the Community Harvest Center 13 months earlier. Not greed, not performance, but that particular unguarded recognition of something arriving without a condition attached. He did not ask whether it was really for everyone this time. He already knew the answer. After dinner, before the cake was cut, Noah came to where I was sitting and pressed a folded piece of paper into my hand, without saying anything. He had written on it, in the careful, oversized print of a child who had taken the task seriously. "Thank you for believing I deserved a future. Your friend Noah." I held the paper for a long time. A year ago, I had stood in a grocery store holding a cake for a table that had decided it was easier without me. Tonight, someone had set a place for me before I arrived. Not because I had organized anything, not because I had paid for anything, not because I had made myself necessary. Simply because I was wanted there. I folded Noah's note and put it in my chest pocket next to my heart, where I keep the things I intend to keep. I have thought about what I would tell a man standing in a grocery store on Thanksgiving morning, holding a cake for a table that has already decided it is easier without him. I would tell him this: the love you give freely is still love, even when the person receiving it mistakes it for a debt they are owed. God does not make mistakes in the people He places in your path. Not your son, not a boy named Noah, asking whether a chocolate cake is really for him. Every encounter has a direction. Trust the current. If I could go back, I would have held my boundaries earlier. I would have let my son stand on his own feet 10 years sooner. I would have understood that absorbing everything is not love. It is a slow way of teaching someone that you are a resource, not a person. Do not make my mistake. The people who are meant to keep you do not need you to make yourself small to earn your place at their table. These grandpa stories are never just about one family. Every family story carries a truth that belongs to all of us. If this family story stayed with you, if this grandpa story changed something in how you see your own table, leave a comment. Share it with someone who needs it, and subscribe so you never miss the next grandpa story we tell together. Thank you for staying until the very end. The stories on this channel contain fictional elements created for educational and entertainment purposes. If this type of content is not for you, we respect that completely. Feel free to explore other content that better suits you. We will be here when you are ready.